When you ask the average European to think about Australia, they usually get very excited. And they'll start talking about the great weather, lots of sun, Uluru, the outback, and of course, we all have kangaroos in our backyard. And when you prod them a bit more, you'll find that Australians are seen as a friendly lot, with a great sporting culture and some very livable cities. However, there's also one thing that is much less known to the average European. My name is Sander van Amelsvoort, and you're probably wondering, why is this Dutch guy talking to us about the rivalry between two Australian cities? I moved to Australia just over 8 years ago, and I work for the Committee for Melbourne, which is an apolitical member network that brings together more than 100 leading organizations from across Melbourne's business, academic, and community sectors. And for the past 12 months, I've been lucky enough to lead the Melbourne 4.0 task force, where together with our members, we looked at the future of Melbourne against the backdrop of a rapidly changing environment. And it is in that context that I'd like to talk to you about this Melbourne-Sydney rivalry. A rivalry that's been around for ages, and often the topic of great banter. Which is the best city to live, which sport is more important, or who serves the best coffee. You can always count on a good discussion. However, there's also times when the rivalry can turn into disputes, even to the point of building an entire new city. As was the case with Canberra in 1908, after a long dispute between Melbourne and Sydney over the location of Australia's seat of government. And so, while rivalries can be great fun and even spur a bit of healthy competition, there's also times when it really doesn't work in our favor. And to illustrate my point, I'd like to show you the following graph. You're probably thinking this must be something between Melbourne and Sydney. But in fact, this is something about the East and the West. The late British economist Angus Maddison did some phenomenal work plotting out the economic history of the world all the way back to the year 1. And as you can see, for the first 18 of the past 20 centuries, China and India made up more than half the world's economy. And so when people talk about the rise of China or the Asian century, they often think about the phenomenal growth that we've seen over the last couple of decades. However, what we're really witnessing is the re-emergence of the historical balance between the East and the West. And when that happens, Australia will be right in the middle of the most lucrative, but also the most intensely competitive regional playing field of the 21st century. And so, today I'd like to talk about what happened here and why it's important for what's happening today and how this Melbourne-Sydney rivalry fits into all of this. But to do that, we have to take a step back even further, about 16,000 years. This is the Social Development Index, and it was developed by Ian Morris from Stanford University. And with social development, Ian Morris refers to a group's ability to master its physical and intellectual environment to get things done. And it's a fascinating chart because, as you can see, for thousands and thousands of years, humankind was on a very slow upward path. Early settlements, wars, empires, religions, philosophies, nothing really made much of a dent. And then about 200 years ago, all of a sudden something profound happened. Or, as Eric Brynjolfsson and Andrew McAfee called it, something happened that literally bent the curve of human history almost 90 degrees. The Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution marks the decisive turning point for humankind, where average incomes and population went through unprecedented and sustained growth. And it certainly gives a whole new meaning to Paul Krugman's phrase when he says that productivity isn't everything, but in the long run it almost is. Since that first industrial revolution, we've had a number of major additional developments. In fact, the World Economic Forum and others have identified another 3 industrial revolutions, all of which have had a profound impact on our societies. The first one, as I mentioned, saw the first wave of urbanization and increased life expectancy in those cities. About 100 years later, the second industrial revolution saw enormous improvements in public health and sanitation, and it saw the rise of the middle class and the introduction of public education. About 100 years later, we saw the third industrial revolution, where enormous advancements were made with the mainframe computer, the personal computer, and the internet. And I don't think I need to explain to you here what an incredible impact that has made. Now, most people believe we're in this third industrial revolution, but in fact, we are at the early stages of the fourth industrial revolution, where we're seeing a fusion of physical, digital, and biological systems. And as you can see, it used to take about 100 years for the next industrial revolution to come along. But the speed at which we are witnessing progress today is rapidly increasing. And in its scale, scope, and complexity, the fourth industrial revolution will be unlike anything humankind has experienced before. It will profoundly change the way we live, work, and do business. So just imagine, in a few decades from now, what billions and billions of people will be able to do when they're connected by mobile devices with almost unlimited processing power and storage capacity. And you multiply all this with today's emerging breakthroughs in nanotechnology, robotics, autonomous vehicles, quantum computing, and artificial intelligence, just to name a few. So you can imagine in such a world, the ability for companies and cities to innovate will be absolutely crucial to their ability to compete and prosper. So where does the Melbourne-Sydney rivalry fit into all of this? Well, let me show you this image. This is a stunning image that NASA, the North American Space Agency, composed between April and October of 2012 of more than 400 images it took of the Earth at night. And it shows the nighttime light emissions of humanity's greatest activity centers, cities. And today, more than half the world's population lives in cities. And for years and years, researchers have been looking into this phenomenon. And then just over a decade ago, 3 urban researchers, Richard Florida, Tim Gulden, and Charlotte Melander, produced a groundbreaking study into the rise of the megaregion. Now, megaregions are integrated sets of cities with their surrounding suburban hinterlands, across which you can easily move capital and labor. And up until their study, we used to look at the world economy almost only through the lens of nation states. However, with today's globalization, capital and labor can move a lot more freely, and so national boundaries mean a lot less. And this brings me to the really interesting part. In their study, they found that the world's top 40 megaregions housed only 18% of the world's population, but they were responsible for 2/3 of global economic output and close to 90% of patented innovation. In other words, megaregions are the central competitive unit. So what do they look like? On the North American continent, we can see the vast Boston, New York, and Washington corridor. Or on the West Coast, the Cascadian corridor stretches all the way from Portland and Seattle right up to Vancouver, across the Canadian border. Or in Southern California, as Parag Khanna has mentioned, the sprawl of Los Angeles passes right down to San Diego, across the Mexican border, into Tijuana. And now even Tijuana and San Diego share an airport terminal into which you can exit into either country. And moving across to Europe, you can see many megaregions, including Europe's largest one, the one that I grew up in, stretching all the way from Amsterdam, right down to the Ruhr in Germany, across Brussels and Antwerp in Belgium, and right down to Lille in the north of France. And moving across to Asia, where the Asian century is being driven by the powerhouse megaregions, such as the Yangtze River Delta, around Shanghai, which only houses 6% of China's population, but produces a massive 20% of that country's economy. And similarly, the Pearl River Delta, with its 11 cities around Hong Kong and Guangzhou, soaks up a massive 20% of China's foreign direct investment. And that's because it's no longer known simply for its copycat products. In fact, it's becoming a world-leading cluster of innovation, with even Apple setting up an R&D center, and The Economist now coining it Silicon Delta. So increasingly, when multinationals are looking to invest, they are looking at mega regions as opposed to individual countries. And so where does this leave Australia? Aside from the major bushfires that you can see in WA, because NASA composed the pictures over a number of months, we have to zoom all the way into the East Coast to see our three capital cities, Brisbane, Sydney, and Melbourne, none of which are forming an integrated megaregion. And so that means our capital cities are often competing with each other for investment, and in many instances simply lack the scale to play at the global stage. And so here's my point. If we recognize that, one, Asia is regaining its historical prominence, and that Australia will be right in the thick of it. Two, that we are at the early stages of the fourth industrial revolution, in which the ability to innovate will be absolutely crucial. And three, that megaregions are the central competitive unit in which economic activity and innovation thrive, then maybe we can start thinking about this Melbourne-Sydney rivalry in a very different light. So what if we were to imagine an Australian East Coast megaregion? A megaregion not only linking up Melbourne and Sydney, but also Brisbane and Canberra. And a megaregion like that would need powerful transport networks. Right now, the airways between Brisbane, Sydney, and Melbourne are among the busiest in the world, so we need a much better land transport network. And high-speed rail has been talked about for ages in Australia, and we really need to start acting on the ideas that are already out there. And given today's rate of innovation, we might even be able to leapfrog rail technology altogether in favor of a hyperloop, which is a pod in a vacuum tube traveling at 1,000 kilometers an hour. So this would see you from the CBD in Melbourne to the CBD in Sydney in less than an hour. And I suspect that's quicker than the morning commute of many of you here today. However, this is not only about linking up the capital cities. Far from it, actually, because critical to the formation of a megaregion is the activation of the regions. Now imagine that same Hyperloop getting you from Geelong to Melbourne in just 4 minutes, or Albury-Wodonga in another 15. And yes, I know these technologies are still at a very, very early stage, but so were autonomous vehicles only just a few years ago. And that brings me to another aspect of connectivity. An East Coast megaregion would also need world-class internet. Successful economies in the 21st century will be underpinned by digital business models with a global reach. And as you can tell, today Australia is at the bottom of the top 50 in global internet speeds. And that's just not good enough, particularly for a country that is geographically as isolated as Australia. However, this is not only an idea about economic growth. Activating the regions will also relieve the enormous pressures on our capital cities, which are projected to double the size of their populations in the next 30 years. And so if we don't have an integrated and holistic planning approach across state borders, we're certainly not going to be seeing a doubling in our livability. And finally, there's a wise old saying that says, when goods don't cross borders, soldiers will. And no more is this evident than the continent that I grew up in. For centuries and centuries, the European continent was ravaged by wars between pretty much every single country on the continent. And after the Second World War, this ultimately led to the formation of the European Union, when Germany and France decided to combine their coal and steel industries. And today it's practically unthinkable for Germany and France to go to war with each other again. And so the even deeper global connections that an East Coast mega region would contribute to builds on this idea and promotes international collaboration rather than confrontation. So, this Melbourne-Sydney rivalry. What if we stop talking about why one city is better than the other and instead combine forces on the global stage? What if we truly aim higher and start asking ourselves the question, what can we do together that we can't do alone? I truly believe these ideas that I've talked about today need some further development, but I also truly believe they are an idea worth sharing with you today, because all too often we get told that they're way too difficult or that we can't afford them. But I'd like to turn that around and have all of you ask here today, can we afford not to? Thank you.